So I try to be original and creative in everything I do. So this concept of the well is my own personal creation. It's my own idea. I try to do videos like this to get people to think and expand their minds. I think the mind is like a muscle that needs to be exercised like any other part of the body, not just the left side of the brain, which is more pragmatic, but the right side of the brain as well, which is more artsy or more creative, if you will. Now, some people do not value knowledge if it's not practical in some way, like how to do something. And don't get me wrong, I know how useful practical information can be for the left side of the brain, like how to fix a car, etc. But if all you learn in this life is how to maintain the reality around you, then you are missing the reason for existence itself and the finer things in life that give it meaning. If by the time you leave this world, you find that you have only read the equivalent of a how-to journal, then you have never really truly lived. Can you imagine a life lived without art, without music, without spirituality, never listening to the Moonlight Sonata by Beethoven, or maybe watching or looking at Picasso's one of his works of art in person, let alone all the best popular music out there and other works of art? And it gets even worse when someone's spiritual life is dead. So this video is going to tie in both the creative arts, the spiritual realm, and more. Now, I use a lot of examples from mythology and other sources, but that doesn't mean I endorse said examples. I'm not telling you to go out there and worship Thor or something. It's just an example. I'm simply using things like this to prove a point. I'm a Christian, so I'm just trying to make a point. That's it. So don't read too much into that. So for me, there is a link to the spiritual in everything we do. And I think there is a certain degree of mystery in the spiritual realm itself. And I personally find this to be intriguing. So let's begin with a look at the creative process itself. And I'm not sure if this will demystify the process or not, but this should prove interesting regardless. So for many people, being creative is completely foreign or alien to them in varying degrees. So there's a certain curiosity or admiration for that quality in people that they find lacking within themselves, whether true or not. But they may or may not think they have it within themselves to be creative, but that doesn't mean that is necessarily true. And then you have the people who have always longed to be a rock star or an artist and just didn't know how. And then you have those of us who consider ourselves to be creative, but still admire the creative talents of those around us who we think are special in that area. So therein lies the mystery. How and why are some people blessed with creativity? Where does this inspiration come from? Who or what is their muse? And where does this information, again, come from? Is it just poof out of midair? Does it come from a special place? And that's one of the things we're going to look at. Now, in the case of, say, like someone like Paul McCartney, for example, the idea for his classic song, Yesterday, came to him in a dream. And I'm sure there are a lot of other examples of this too, where people get their ideas from a dream. Then that leads to the question, where do dreams come from? And we get into more specifics on this later, but first allow me to introduce the metaphor of the well. Imagine, if you will, that there is a great well in an otherworldly realm where all ideas spring from. All music, all art, poetry, and inspiration in general flow freely from this well, but from nowhere else. But it's the streams that flow hidden throughout the world that somehow find their way to the people that need those visions. And all great discoveries and solutions and ideas for inventions flow within the currents of its many streams. And we simply have to find those to become open to its currents to access the well. And since we are on the subject of these streams that originate in the well, wouldn't that be why they call it a stream of consciousness? And have you ever wondered why they call it a live stream? And that is what this is all about. The metaphor of a well as a source of multiple rivers that flow invisibly throughout the entire world and bring people thoughts and inspiration. And I think multiple people can tune in to the same river at the same time, or all jump in at the river at the same time. Kind of like we are all radios that can tune in to the same radio station at times. Like we can both or all of us be affected by the same frequency, or sometimes the frequency is individual and only meant for one person. So like a message in a bottle that floats down the current only to be received by one person. So now keep in mind, the metaphor itself is just something I have speculated upon, but it's not the only metaphor out there. For example, since we're talking about frequencies can act as a wave, like a radio wave, but we can use an ocean wave as a symbol of this. So usually in surfing, only one person is riding a wave at one time. That's the way it should be, it's just polite. But in some overcrowded places like Malibu, multiple people end up catching the same wave at the same time. But we're going to use this example of many people catching the same wave at the same time anyway for the sake of simplicity. Like for example, sometimes a group of people spontaneously share a similar thought that just sort of magically pops into all their heads at once at the same time. So that current or wave can affect multiple people at once. This is akin to multiple people sharing the same dream. Now keep in mind that this is not the same thing as voice-to-skull technology, which is a sort of imitation that man-made version that manipulates that, but it's not exactly the real thing. It's an imitation of the real thing. But we're not talking about voice-to-skull technology. We are talking about authentic spiritual transmissions of ideas and concepts or creative inspirations. So it might be possible that something like deja vu is connected to all this, but that is just conjecture on my part. I have had a clairvoyant dream once where I saw the future, and I have spoken to other people who have claimed to have had similar experiences. It talks about that in the Bible, so it's not like I'm the only example that's ever happened to. But before you become dismissive of the suggestion, keep in mind that the United States government has experimented with things like dreams and time travel experiments and out-of-body experiences for quite some time. They wouldn't be doing that if there wasn't something to it. Itzhak Bentov wrote about the mind and time travel, among other things of this nature, like remote viewing, etc. But I'm not saying it's good, bad, or this, that, or the other thing. We're just using this stuff as an example. His work was appropriated by the armed forces, which published the Gateway Process. And then the CIA wrote an analysis and assessment of the Gateway Process. So this was an exploration of the bounds of human consciousness and what could be achieved. This also led to out-of-body states of consciousness and improving cognitive abilities. The Gateway Process utilized guided meditations, visualization exercises, and utilizing binaural beats to synchronize the brain's hemispheres. It is said that this leads to remote viewing, astral projection, and even time travel. The CIA is involved with the Gateway Process, so this gives more validity to the topic in general. So don't just take it out on me and just shut yourself down. Don't turn your brain off because it's something that you're not used to, because the government's sure interested in it. So, for example, Lieutenant Colonel Wayne M. McDonnell discussed techniques to focus energy movement within consciousness in the Gateway Process by utilizing the visualization of a well or tunnel that symbolizes the path through which consciousness descends to deeper states. It is sometimes referred to as a vortex, a gateway, or a well of light, which reminds me of the near-death experience of following a light at the end of a tunnel or at the end of a well after the mind naturally allows DMT into the brain during death or the death process. So the government was also involved with MKUltra in conjunction with other mind experiments and time travel via Montauk and the Montauk chair, etc. This is probably connected to Project Pegasus as well, according to Andrew Asiago. The DARPA time machines in Project Pegasus worked like a tunnel or a well, linking you to the past or future. The connection of a time travel vortex designed by Tesla to a well may be loose, but the connections to another dimension or place in time remain constant, as well as is a spiritual metaphor as a doorway to other worlds or the underworld, and the realm of the spirit is in another dimension because God dwells in a dimension outside of time. And if you take into account the pineal gland that acts something like a spiritual antenna, it receives information from the spiritual realm like waves or frequencies, or like water drawn from the depth of a well. It is connected to deep sleep and death, as well as spiritual messages. But if the act of creation itself could be seen as a spiritual act, as in willing something into existence from the ethereal plane of ideas, then perhaps it is connected to inspiration as well, as in when a solution to an ongoing issue seems to bubble up as if from nowhere to the top of the mind, seemingly again out of nowhere. So that aha or eureka moment itself could be seen as an act of inspiration, perhaps attracted to the individual themselves via the frequency of the mind or the person. And now let's take a look at Carl Jung and how he relates to this topic of the archetype of a metaphorical well, from which inspiration flows into the minds of this carnal existence. Now, Carl Jung was a huge influence on psychology, literature, and religious studies, but he was best known for his concept of archetypes. But before we get to all that, let's talk about Carl Jung's concept of the collective unconscious. Carl Jung looked into the dreams of the unconscious minds of individuals and noticed very similar patterns in the comparative religion and mythologies of the world. Now, before we get deeper into this, I just wanted to make the distinction between what I am saying and what Carl Jung's point of view is. Carl Jung saw religion and mythology as a byproduct of the human mind or imagination, but I see mythology and religion as outside of the mind, as a real continuum of the spiritual realm or dimension, which are separate from the mind of the individual, but connected to the pineal gland via sympathetic frequencies. But I digress. What Carl Jung noticed was uncanny similarities between the subconscious symbols between unrelated people's dreams, etc., and the same similarities to various mythological motifs and the stories and images of varied religions as well. In other words, humanity tends to share the same subconscious symbolism collectively as the collective mythological and religious narratives and symbolism do as well. So Jung's theory of a collective unconscious is similar to the idea of multiple people being all affected by the same wave, or mutually receptive to the same stream of consciousness from the well. And within this collective unconscious, we find archetypes. And these archetypes include, but are not limited to, death, rebirth, mother, power, father, the hero, and the child, etc. But let's get back to the well, shall we? Jung often described the unconscious mind as a deep well or water source hidden beneath the surface of consciousness. In the archetypes and the collective unconscious, he wrote that symbols of water, wells, and springs represent the unfathomable depths of the mind, a place from which both creative insight and danger arise. He also sometimes called the unconscious the quote-unquote well of life because it is both the origin of psychic energy and the reservoir of forgotten or repressed memories and material. In other words, the well is a symbol of the unconscious, a source of light, yet also of darkness, such as in the film The Ring. And now for example of a dream. I'm standing in a quiet meadow and notice a small well. Peering down, I see dark water at the bottom. I feel drawn to it and yet afraid to look at it closely. In a Jungian interpretation, 1, the well equals the unconscious mind, the depths of the psyche, the hidden part of yourself that holds feelings, memories, instincts, and creative potential. I could go on, but I do not want to get too far off track. So we mentioned mythology and how Carl Jung linked this mythology and religion to the collective unconscious. So let's have a quick introduction to that, shall we? Now, I see things like fairy tales and mythology as being part of the larger continuum of the spiritual realm. That does not mean I think that's a good thing or anything else. In fact, I think these things are probably connected to the Nephilim and the fallen angels. I'm simply using these to make a point, so please don't jump to conclusions about me. Things like fairies, with changelings in particular, more than likely being what we today would call aliens. So, same demons, just a different name. And mythological pantheons, whether they are Egyptian, Babylonian, Norse, Roman, Greek, Celtic, or whatever, seem to be the same fallen angels, just repackaged under a different branding with different names. But that said, if you know what you're looking at, then these archetypes, to borrow from Jung, still have elements of truth in them which shed light on the spiritual realm. Kind of like if you see a shadow, you can be sure it's linked to the person who is in front of the light source. Or to put it another way, where there's smoke, there's fire. So when you see one, you know there's got to be the other, the reflection, etc. So to me, it's a bit like watching the news and trying to use what they say on the surface to try to interpret what it really means. Or like watching a movie to understand the propaganda or the truth that is in plain sight. And don't forget, we are to be as wise as serpents. Now, with all that disclaimer out of the way, let's look at the mythological examples of the well. So, the most obvious mythological example of the well would be the story of Odin and the Well of Wisdom from Norse mythology. Mimir's well, I hope I'm saying that right, was located beneath one of the roots of Yggdrasil, the world tree in Norse mythology, and it was the Well of Wisdom. And if you think about the roots and branches of the world tree as conduits of its streams, then you will see that its waters run through everything in this myth. Odin sacrifices his eye into the well to be allowed to drink from it, and thus gaining a deep knowledge of all things. It is the archetype of the well of thought, or literally knowledge drawn from the depths, or the still waters, if you will, that run deep. But there were actually 3 wells in this mythology to correspond to the 3 Norns of fate that represented past, present, and future. These 3 women are a Norse version of the 3 fates of Greek mythology, who, interestingly enough, in the movie The Clash of the Titans, shared one eye, which brings to mind Odin's sacrifice. Another version of the Norns would be the 3 witches in Macbeth by William Shakespeare, who tell Macbeth about his future. And the same pattern of the 3 fates is echoed in the Irish story of the Morrigan, who is sometimes portrayed as being 3 different women at once. And an interesting side note, the idea of the nightmare. You guys have all heard of nightmares, right? That means like night horse, mare is a horse, meaning a female horse that scares people in their dreams, whose name was Macha, who is forced to win a horse race while pregnant. And now you know where the term nightmare comes from, because she became connected to being a dark horse who would run through your dreams. And this brings us back to the idea of dreams, and how the pineal gland is the antenna to the divine or messages from God, who often come to us through dreams, like, for example, Paul McCartney receiving the music to his classic song Yesterday via a dream. Now, I use the metaphor of a well, but this is really just a convenient way to describe the undescribable. There's a point you get to where words can no longer do justice with what one is experiencing. I think of it like a stream, but it may be something like the metaphor of Jacob's ladder. And in the story of Jacob's ladder, angels are ascending and descending down it like a highway. Angels are, of course, messengers, and not every message is intended for only one person. So the streams from the well deliver messages to those whose frequencies are meant to receive them, and were not so spiritually dead inside to not notice where they are sent to them via the streams from the well. But I digress. And speaking of Irish mythology, that brings up the story of Boann and the well of Sagash, meaning the well of wisdom. So once again, we have a mythical well associated with knowledge or wisdom. The well is mentioned in the Dissensions of early Ireland, and a well that sits in the center of the world. It is surrounded by 9 hazel trees, whose nuts drop into the water. And yes, I did say the word nuts. And these nuts feed the salmon of knowledge. And whoever eats the salmon from the well gains wisdom and poetic inspiration. The well is connected to the water goddess Boann, who created the river Boyne. The story of Boann, or a brief retelling of that story. Boann, whose name basically is related to the word bovine, and that's a whole other story in itself as it relates to Celtic mythology, because there's other points I could bring up about that, but I just don't have time for it right here. But Boann was the wife of Nectin, who guarded a sacred well of wisdom. And around that well were 9 hazel trees, and within the well were 9 salmon of wisdom. Nectin was the only one allowed to come near the well, because it was dangerous for anyone else, because he was the guardian of the well. Boann, though, ends up having an affair with the Allfather god of Celtic mythology, the Dagda. I guess he's kind of similar to Odin in that way. I think Odin was also known as the Allfather. Any event, the Dagda impregnates her while Nectin is away. So he magically keeps the sun in the sky for 9 months, like there's 9 hazel trees, 9 months, so that Boann can bear the child without her husband finding out. So Nectin never notices the time elapsing due to the sun standing still in the sky. But after walking around the well the wrong way 3 times, Boann decides to wash herself off in the sacred well to cover up, I guess, what she had done with adultery, etc. So the well bursts open, causing whole rivers to form from its flow from its origin, including the river Boyne, which is named after her. In the process, she loses one eye, among other limbs, which is similar to the Norse legend of Odin. They both have that one eye motif. In Norse legend, the well was guarded by 3 Norns, which seem to represent past, present, and future. But this might be symbolism for the 3 phases of the moon, meaning waning, waxing, and a full moon. So the moon, after all, was the oldest means of reckoning the passing of days or time in the ancient world. And since in the story of Boann mentioned the sun standing still for 9 months, then the eye that she sacrificed could possibly be the moon. So the 9 hazel trees would be the 9 moons, or the lunar cycle it took to give birth. Then from here we can hypothesize that Odin's eye would be a symbol for the moon as well. And if we remember that in ancient cultures the moon was a symbol for time, then the meaning behind the sacrifice of Odin's eye is really the sacrifice of time. So one must sacrifice time in order to obtain wisdom. Just speculation on my part. And as we previously discussed, the gateway process of the CIA and its links to the well, so to speak, were all associated with time and time travel. And the shaft or tunnel description used to describe time travel could definitely be likened to a well. But once again, I digress. This brings us to Greek mythology. In one myth, the winged horse Pegasus strikes the earth with his foot and creates the spring of the waters of inspiration. The muses drink from this spring, so this is quite literally the well of art and thought, as drinking from its waters grants poetic inspiration. And since we are just talking about time travel, the time travel operation of the CIA was said to be titled Project Pegasus. Interesting, right? Now, in the Bible, the angel of God appears to Hagar beside a desert well, a symbol of divine revelation and compassion. And then there is the story of Jesus at the same well where Jacob met Rachel, where he said, "Whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst again. Mine is the water of eternal life." Okay, now in Hinduism, there is the well of Soma. Soma is the drink of the gods. It is often depicted as being drawn from a hidden well or a cosmic ocean. Soma is the drink that provides immortality as well. It is said to be the source of consciousness and divine ecstasy, and sacred rivers in India are said to emerge from underground wells or springs at the foot of Mount Meru, the world axis, or the center of the world, which is interesting because I believe Israel was considered to be the center of the world as well. It's funny how these things kind of overlap like that. In any event, there are other examples throughout the world of symbolism and of mythical wells, but I'm going to move on from there because I don't want to spend too much time on it to get too far off a track. I think you guys get the point. So let's talk about Itzhak Bentov, who was a Czechoslovakian scientist, mystic, and author. He studied how the brain interprets various frequencies. He was invested in mapping out the metaphysical realms of consciousness, and it is said that after he passed away unexpectedly, that his ideas were conveniently taken over by the CIA to create the Gateway process. Bentov described the universe as a cosmic oscillation where everything vibrates around a central point of perfect stillness, like the center of the world again, interesting, which somewhat resembles the mythological stories of a great well at the center of the earth, like we were just talking about. He went on to say that this point of pure consciousness is effectively the wellhead, or the origin from which all motion, perception, and thought arises from, and from which they will return. He stated that meditation allows the mind to approach this still center where time ceases and awareness merges with the universal field. Bentov also wrote about a holographic universe and the cosmic reservoir, where every part of the universe contains the information of the whole. He said that consciousness was being drawn from the cosmic reservoir, a bit like a well, where consciousness isn't generated, it's received from a deeper source, like dipping a bucket into a shared field. And he went on to add that the brain does not produce consciousness, it tunes into it like a frequency. And as previously stated, Bentov's ideas were utilized in the Gateway process of the CIA, which explicitly described consciousness as a well of energy and information accessible through coherent resonance. And just as a quick recap of Bentov's concepts in relation to the well metaphor, the still point would be the bottom of the well, the cosmic reservoir would be the deep water, the node or standing wave would be the opening of the well, and meditation would be the act of lowering the bucket into the well. Like Itzhak Bentov, Terence McKenna was also involved with exploring consciousness and metaphysical experiments. McKenna often described reality as a kind of field of intelligence. He said that all creativity, thought, and imagination, quote-unquote, bubble up from the deeper source of the cosmic mind. He also wrote that the psychedelic experience reveals a fountain of being, a wellspring of information pouring into history. So this was a fountain of novelty that feeds human consciousness, basically like a well of thought that you can dip into. McKenna was also quoted as saying that it's as though you discover a well of meaning that has been waiting for you to dip into it. So consciousness taps into an existing autonomous source of language and thought, not something the ego creates, but something it receives. McKenna had also talked about time wave zero and the well of novelty. His time wave zero theory proposed that time itself flows toward an infinite consequence of novelty, a kind of ultimate point or vortex from which new forms and ideas continually emerge. He once described this as a cascading waterfall of connectedness, flowing into history from a transcendental domain. And from this, you can hear the same wellspring metaphor imagery, even if mixed with hydrological metaphors. And last, McKenna compared shamanic experience to drinking from the well of the world's soul. And one thing that McKenna, Itzhak Bentov, and John C. Lilly would all agree upon is that each sees the mind not as a generator of ideas, but as a receiver or diver that plunges or dips into the well, so to speak, or tunes into the radio station, if you will. They all modernized the well into the cosmic reservoir, a universal consciousness or informational ocean. And previously, in the 18th and 19th centuries, mysticism and myth fuse with early psychology and art. Poets like Yeats speak of the imagination as a deep well or a hidden spring. Nietzsche refers to the wells of the spirit that the modern mind must rediscover. William Blake writes of fountains of living imagination within the human from the divine. The well becomes the unseen source of creativity, intuition, and dream. So we spoke earlier about time travel and how it is possibly connected to the well, with the well being a metaphor for the inspiration that esoterically springs into existence from an otherworldly source. But if you consider time to be all happening at once, as in past, present, and future, all at the same time, then there would be some symbolic overlap with the Akashic records, because if the sources of all streams of thought originate back to a proverbial well, then all of our thoughts and inspirations are really just borrowed from the source. And if there truly was nothing new under the sun, then that would be because everything has already been thought of before. But how can you think of something new if it has already existed before you? So if everything exists in this esoteric library, past, present, and future, in a spiritual dimension, then they would contain a cosmic database of everything and be a sort of collective consciousness of everything. And these experiences have been likened to descending a staircase, or finding a pool, or discovering a well of light. And like the dreams of inspiration that inspired people like Paul McCartney to write a song, they can both ascend through dreams and be accessed through dreams. And at this point, I think it's fitting to look at a few Christian examples of well symbolism. So in Christian mysticism, the well becomes the soul itself. For example, the well is deep, and you have nothing to draw with. This quote from the Gospel of John turns the physical well into a metaphor for the soul's longing for divine water. Now, mystics like Saint Teresa describe the inner well as the meeting point between humanity and God, and in general, the medieval time of this era transforms the external sacred spring into an internal depth, as in the well within the heart, which the contemplative descends to reach divine truth. So in closing, I just wanted to say a few things. My intentions with this are to open your mind to creative thought and inspiration. Jesus Christ always comes first, but even with outreach, it's good to open your mind to new ideas to reach people. And if all you see is the same repetitive things over and over again, then whether you realize it or not, your spirit will begin to die inside. So take a painting and turn it upside down. Play a song you've never heard before. Read scripture outside for a while. And in other words, I'm trying to free your mind, Neo, but I can only show you the door. You are the one who has to walk through it. There are things that are known, and there are things that are unknown, and in between are the doors.